During his ministry on earth, Jesus gained the trust, respect, and admiration of many. His wisdom, his teachings, his understanding of the Scriptures, and especially the way he treated people made the crowds follow him. But everything also made him be envied, hated, rejected, and persecuted, and perhaps the person who has most fueled these ruined feelings for the Son of God may have been a man called Caiaphas, who was the high priest of the temple at that time. That is, he was the most important religious figure of the people of God and was responsible for entering the Holy of Holies and offering the sacrifices of the Jewish people to the Lord. But despite all this, Caiaphas was one of those directly responsible, not to say the most responsible, for the death of Jesus. And in this video I will show you what the terrible end of life was like of this man so evil and perverse that instead of being the first to recognize that Jesus was the Messiah they had been waiting for, he ended up handing him over to the Roman Empire to die on the cross. I'm sure you will be surprised and even amazed at the latest chapters from the life of Caiaphas. So that we can talk about the end of the high priest's life, we first need to know who he was, what his role was in that society, and especially the entire religious and political context that involved the Roman Empire and the Jewish people in Jesus' time. And it is important to remember that not all information contained in this video is recorded in the Bible, but they were raised by theologians specialized in the political and cultural events of the Roman Empire in the times of Jesus after many years of studies in historical documents found in the Roman ruins and ancient Jerusalem. Christ came into the world in a period when Israel and Judah were no longer divided as in Old Testament times. The region was part of the Roman Empire and was known as Judea, and this occupation carried out by Rome imposed a centralized government system that changed people's lives for the worse, with the collection of high taxes and the creation of laws that made the people practically slaves to the emperor. And it was in this tense scenario that two religious leaders influentially emerged, Annas and Caiaphas, two high priests of the Temple of Jerusalem, who, in addition to the religious issues of the Jews, such as sacrifices and annual celebrations, they also managed the trade and finances of that place. Caiaphas only became high priest and gained all the power he had because in the year 18 after Christ, he married the daughter of Annas, whose main objective was to maintain control of the temple and the Jewish faith within his family circle. Anna was so thirsty for power that he did not want to see another leader in Jerusalem who was not himself or who was not in his hands. And why did he do so much? The issue of maintaining this control, because he was highly corrupt and took advantage of his position, is steal the offerings left by the people in the temple, in addition to using his influence to deceive people to obtain personal benefits. And talking about Caiaphas, in addition to being all of this, he was an opportunist man who thirsted for power and did not accept that someone else had more prominence and admiration than him. And he was also very intelligent and had the ability to deal with the Roman political authorities, and this made him a Jew who was highly respected by the empire. The will of the empire, so they did whatever was necessary to maintain order among the Jews so that they would not rebel against the emperor and give the beginning of a revolution. And it is exactly this point that leads us to understand the actions of Caiaphas and Annas in relation to the arrest, trial and crucifixion of Jesus. Furthermore, they were part of a sect that did not believe in the resurrection of the dead or in the final judgment. That are two messages that Jesus used to teach the people who followed him during his ministry. And speaking of Jesus, he was a big thorn in the side of Caiaphas and Annas, because his teachings and miracles were attracting more and more Jews to the faith that would one day become Christianity. Caiaphas and Annas and other religious leaders were concerned that Jesus' charisma and popularity might lead to a popular uprising, so the people did not approve of the Roman government, and this gained even more strength after the Lord resurrected Lazarus. See what is written in John chapter 11. The chief priests and the Pharisees call a meeting at the cedar. "What are we doing?" they asked. "There is this man performing many miraculous signs. If we let him, everyone will believe in him, and then the Romans will come and take away both our place and our nation." See, this fear led Caiaphas and other leaders to create a plan to arrest Jesus and kill him. But he knew that arrest could not be public, because that would only generate more. So they spent months trying to find a way to capture this man who claimed to be the Son of God before his influence became so great that he became a real threat. And while Caiaphas thought of a way to arrest Jesus, he negotiated with the Roman authorities to ensure that man paid for his supposed mistakes in an exemplary way, and would not return to live with Jews, because only then would the Roman Empire would be free from a popular revolution. Until one day Caiaphas and Annas saw in the greed of one of Jesus' disciples the opportunity they had been waiting for to arrest him. After talking to the religious leaders, Judas Iscariot agreed to hand over his master in exchange of 30 silver coins that would be worth around 15,000 today. The plan was already drawn up. Judas would take Caiaphas, Annas, and the soldiers, Romans, to arrest Jesus at night is a place far from the presence of the people who followed him, so there was no time for a revolt. But the work of the priests was not yet finished. They went to the Sanhedrin, which was the Jewish council of religious leaders, to justify the condemnation of Jesus and manipulate those men so that they accepted the denunciation made against Christ. Then Caiaphas went to Pontius Pilate, who was the prefect of Judea and representative of the Roman Empire in that region, to accuse Jesus and demand a decision that would end in crucifixion. And then, when Pilate went to interrogate Jesus, he did not defend himself, and he even said something surprising about Caiaphas. Look at what is written in John chapter 19. "You refuse to speak to me," Pilate said. "You don't know that I have the authority to free you and to crucify you." Jesus replied, "You wouldn't have any authority over me if I didn't have it, if it were given from above. Therefore he who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." Jesus said that Caiaphas would suffer a terrible consequence, because he was not just going against the innocent man, but against the Son of God himself. And as Pilate did not believe that Jesus presented any kind of risk to Rome, much less had he done anything to receive that sentence of death, Caiaphas, Annas, and other temple religious were even the people to encourage him to ask for the execution of that man. And so it happened. Pilate offered to crucify Barabbas, a dangerous bandit of the time, in exchange for Jesus. But the people refused, so that Roman washed his hands, and Christ ended up being condemned and killed. But the involvement of Caiaphas with Jesus does not tend to after the resurrection of the Lord on the third day. Caiaphas refused to accept that he was the Messiah and had come back to life. After feeling the earth shake, seeing the sun go down, and witnessing the veil of the temple tearing in half, as the scriptures said it would happen, and all this denial had to do not just with the fact that Caiaphas did not believe in the resurrection of the dead, but because that would mean a challenge to his authority, and mainly because it would shake the foundations of people's faith, opening their eyes to the truth that Christ always preached while he was in. It's just that Caiaphas and Annas didn't just focus on the denialist speech about the resurrection of Christ. They also persecuted, arrested, tortured, and even killed those who preached that the Messiah had come to surrender and return to life. And among these victims of the Jewish religious leaders was a man called Stephen, one of the first deacons of the primitive church, was killed by stoning in a public square for declaring his faith in Jesus. But what? Caiaphas did not expect that his days of glory and power were about to end. About 3 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus, the Roman Empire discovered that he was using his position to steal money from the temple and benefit from the taxes that were collected of the Jews. So he would have been expelled from his position in Judea, tried and condemned by the Roman Empire. People who study historical documents from that time believe that Caiaphas would receive the death penalty because his actions were considered high treason against the emperor. But before being taken to Rome to hear his sentence, Caiaphas would have been whipped by the soldiers of the empire, and during the journey to the capital he would have died as a result of the injuries he suffered. And about Annas, he also came to his end years later, suffering greatly at the hands of the Romans. And in the years 199-90, Israeli archaeologists found the ossuary belonging to Caiaphas and members of his family, proving his existence and his position as head of the Jewish religion in the 1st century after the birth of Jesus. Brothers, we cannot say with absolute certainty that these really were the end of the lives of Annas and Caiaphas. As I said at the beginning of this video, some of these events that we saw are in the Bible, while others are in other books and documents from that time. What is certain is that Caiaphas was a cruel man, a man who was used by Satan to condemn Jesus. Yes, we know that the death of Christ was already prophesied in the Old Testament more than 1,000 years before it happened. Furthermore, it was necessary for our salvation, because without the cross of Christ we wouldn't be here talking about this. But that doesn't take away from Caiaphas, Annas, and so many other men who persecuted Jesus the responsibility and weight of their death. All of us, without exception, came into the world with free will that makes us capable of choosing which paths we will follow. I ask you what kind of fruit you've been producing lately. The Word of God in several passages compares it to a fruit tree that needs producing good fruit. Is so much so that in Matthew chapter 7 verse 19, Jesus said that every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. And one more important thing that needs to be said: will not be religion that will save you. Remember that Annas and Caiaphas were high priests, that is, they were leaders of the faith of God's people. They occupied the position that was previously occupied by Aaron, brother of Moses, and his sons. But none of this was able to save them, because they never had a real encounter with Jesus. They heard Jesus preach. They witnessed healings, miracles, and even resurrections, but they still did not want to surrender to the King of Kings. And if you liked it, leave your like and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a single video. God bless.